Have you ever noticed that you make decisions without really deciding? You react, you choose, you move forward, and only later you tell yourself a story about why. It feels natural, logical. But what if something invisible has been guiding those choices the whole time, quietly shaping what feels right, wrong, possible, or impossible? It's like waking up in the middle of a dream you didn't know you were having. You assume you're seeing life clearly, responding to what's happening. But what if the way you observe reality is already bending it before you act? What if your perception isn't following the world, but shaping it? This question sits at the edge between modern science and ancient insight. And once you let it in, the way you look at everything, including yourself, can never be the same. That sentence sounds simple, almost obvious, but if you let it land fully, it quietly dismantles the way most people believe life works. You wake up and think the day will happen to you. Events will unfold, people will act, circumstances will arrive, and you'll respond. That's the story we were taught. But if you slow down and observe closely, something far more unsettling appears. The same event can feel like opportunity to one person and punishment to another. The same words can sound like care or attack. The same silence can feel peaceful or threatening. If reality were only what happens, none of that would make sense. What changes is not the event, it's the observer. Your perception is not a passive window, it's an active filter, and that filter decides in real time what something means, how intense it feels, and what you're allowed to see at all. Two people can stand in the same room, hear the same sentence, and walk away living in completely different worlds. One feels expanded, the other feels diminished. Nothing out there changed between them. This is uncomfortable to accept because it removes the idea that reality is fixed and neutral. It suggests that what you experience is deeply shaped by your internal state long before logic steps in, and most of the time, that shaping happens automatically. Think about a moment when you were already irritated. A small inconvenience suddenly felt huge. A delay felt disrespectful. A neutral look felt judgmental. Now remember a moment when you felt calm and grounded. The same inconvenience barely registered. The delay became space. The neutral look meant nothing. The external world did not transform. Your perception did. Your nervous system, your expectations, your emotional tone, they quietly instruct your mind on what to notice and how to interpret it. You don't see reality as it is. You see reality as your system is prepared to see it. There's a reason memory is unreliable. It's not a recording, it's a reconstruction. Each time you remember something, you rebuild it through your current lens. That alone tells you perception is not secondary. It's central, and it's always active. What's even more striking is that your perception doesn't just color experience after it happens. It often shapes experience before it fully unfolds. You anticipate tone. You assume intent. You project outcome. Long before a situation finishes revealing itself, your mind has already written most of the script. And once that script is in place, your attention starts searching for evidence to confirm it. If you expect rejection, your perception becomes exquisitely sensitive to anything that could signal distance. If you expect support, you notice warmth where others might miss it. The mind is efficient that way. It wants coherence more than truth. It wants to feel right more than curious. This is where many people misunderstand control. They try to manage circumstances while ignoring the lens through which those circumstances are interpreted. They move, change jobs, change relationships, change routines, and feel the same patterns repeating. The details shift, but the emotional flavor stays eerily consistent. That consistency is not bad luck, it's perceptual continuity. Your inner state trains your perception, and your perception trains your experience. It's a loop so tight it feels invisible. And because it's invisible, it feels like fate. Pause for a moment and notice how you're reading these words. Are you scanning quickly, looking for agreement? Are you skeptical, waiting for something to contradict? Are you open, reflective, slightly unsettled? The words haven't changed. The meaning you extract from them depends on how you're oriented right now. This is not about blame. You didn't choose your initial conditioning. Your perception was shaped by repetition, environment, protection, survival. It learned patterns that once made sense. The problem is not that perception filters reality. The problem is forgetting that it does. Once you forget, you assume your interpretation is the event itself. You react to meaning instead of stimulus. You defend against stories instead of facts. And slowly, without noticing, your world becomes smaller, more predictable, more confined. The shift begins when you stop asking, "What is happening?" and start asking, "How am I seeing this?" That question alone creates a small gap, and in that gap, something important happens. Perception becomes observable instead of automatic. At first, this can feel destabilizing. If reality isn't solid, if meaning isn't fixed, then what can you rely on? But that discomfort is not a loss of ground. It's the moment you realize you were standing on interpretation all along. As awareness grows, you begin to sense that perception itself has structure. It has habits. It has momentum. It leans toward what feels familiar. And familiarity often disguises itself as truth. This realization naturally leads to a deeper question, one most people avoid, because it challenges the idea of objective control. If perception shapes reality so profoundly, where does perception come from? And what exactly is guiding it moment by moment? Because beneath perception lies something even more influential, a predictive system quietly constructing the world before you consciously arrive to see it. That idea alone can feel strange, even unsettling, because it goes against what you were taught to assume. You believe your eyes are windows. That light comes in, information arrives, and then your brain simply records what's there. But that's not what's happening, not even close. What your brain is actually doing every second of your life is guessing what's out there before you consciously experience it. By the time you think you're seeing something, your brain has already made a prediction about what it expects to find. Sight, sound, touch. They're not raw data being received. They're corrections, adjustments, small updates to an internal model that was already running ahead of you. This means you are never encountering reality fresh. You are meeting a version of reality your brain prepared in advance. Your brain is a survival machine. Its main job is not truth, it's efficiency. Waiting to fully process every stimulus would be too slow. So instead, it builds expectations based on past experience and uses incoming signals only to confirm or slightly modify those expectations. Most of the time, what you perceive is not what's out there, but what your brain decided was most likely to be out there. That's why you can read a sentence with missing letters and still understand it. That's why you can hear your name in a noisy room. That's why you sometimes don't notice something obvious until it's pointed out. Your brain isn't scanning everything equally. It's prioritizing what fits the prediction it's already running. And here's where it becomes personal. Those predictions aren't neutral. They're shaped by memory, emotion, identity, and belief. If you've been disappointed many times, your brain predicts disappointment. If you've learned that certain situations are unsafe, your brain predicts threat. If you associate certain people with judgment, your brain prepares defensiveness before a word is spoken. So when you walk into a room, your brain has already decided what kind of room it is. Friendly or hostile, safe or tense, worth engaging or better avoided. Your senses then look for evidence to support that forecast. Anything that contradicts it is often softened, ignored, or reinterpreted. This is why two people can experience the same moment so differently. One feels welcomed, the other feels excluded. One hears neutrality, the other hears criticism. The environment didn't split. The predictions did. You might think you're reacting to what someone said, but often you're reacting to what your brain expected them to mean. This also explains why change feels so difficult even when circumstances improve. You can be in a better job, a healthier relationship, a safer environment, and still feel the same tension. The brain is still running an old prediction model. And until that model updates, the present keeps being interpreted through the past. Notice how quickly your mind fills gaps. A delayed message becomes a story. A brief reply becomes a signal. A facial expression becomes a verdict. Those stories feel immediate and convincing because they arrive already formed. You don't experience the prediction as a guess. You experience it as reality. And once the prediction is confirmed a few times, it strengthens. The brain says, "See, I was right." Not because it was accurate, but because it was consistent. This doesn't mean your brain is broken. It means it's doing exactly what it evolved to do. The problem arises when predictions become rigid, when they stop updating, when they keep running, even though the world, and you, have changed. There's a quiet moment you can catch if you pay attention. It happens right before interpretation locks in, a fraction of a second where sensation is still ambiguous, where meaning hasn't fully landed yet. Most people rush past that moment, but it's there. In that gap, you can sometimes feel the prediction forming, a tightening in the body, a quick emotional shift, a familiar inner comment. That's the model activating. That's the brain saying, "I know what this is." The more unaware you are of this process, the more your life feels automatic. You think you're responding, but you're mostly confirming. You think you're choosing, but you're often following a script written long ago. And here's the subtle but important part. Because your brain predicts the world, it also predicts you. It predicts how you'll respond, how capable you are, how much effort is worth giving. Those predictions quietly shape your behavior. You hesitate where you could move. You withdraw where you could speak. You settle where you could explore. Not because you lack willpower, but because the prediction says this is how it usually goes. Understanding this doesn't instantly change the predictions, but it does something else first. It creates distance. You begin to realize that what feels obvious might just be familiar, that what feels true might just be repeated. And once you see that your experience of reality is being continuously constructed inside you, a new question naturally begins to surface. If the brain is always predicting, always shaping perception before awareness arrives, then what determines the predictions themselves? Because beneath prediction lies something even deeper, the role of the observer, and how observation itself influences what becomes real. For most of your life, science was presented to you as something clean and distant. Equations on a board, facts to memorize, a universe that runs like a machine, unaffected by who is watching. The observer, you were told, should be invisible, neutral, irrelevant. Reality exists out there, complete and finished, whether anyone is looking or not. But when physics went deep enough, far beyond everyday objects and into the fabric of matter itself, that story quietly fell apart. At the quantum level, something strange kept happening. Particles didn't behave like solid things. They behaved like probabilities, like waves of potential. And most unsettling of all, those probabilities didn't resolve into something definite until measurement occurred, until observation entered the picture. This wasn't philosophy. It was experiment after experiment refusing to behave as expected. What disturbed scientists was not just that particles changed behavior when measured. It was that the act of observation itself could not be separated from the outcome. The observer wasn't just watching reality unfold. The observer was participating in how it unfolded. For a long time, this implication was pushed aside, treated as a technical issue, a mathematical quirk, something to calculate around, not sit with, because if taken seriously, it challenged a deeply comforting idea, that reality is fully independent of us. You were taught the cleaned-up version, the version where observation is passive, where meaning is extracted, not involved, where the universe doesn't care whether you're paying attention. But the deeper truth never really went away. It just stayed out of reach of everyday conversation. The observer effect doesn't mean your thoughts magically control particles. That's a misunderstanding. What it points to is something subtler and more unsettling. That reality at its most fundamental level is not fully defined until interaction occurs, until relationship exists, until something meets something else. Observation is not neutral contact. It's an interaction. And when you zoom back out from particles to people, the implications quietly echo everywhere. You are always observing, measuring, interpreting, paying attention in one direction instead of another. And just like in quantum experiments, what you attend to becomes more defined, more solid, more real in your experience. What you ignore remains vague, background, potential. This is not mystical, it's practical. Your attention has weight. Think about how different your life feels when your attention is fixed on problems versus when it's fixed on possibilities. The same circumstances can feel heavy or workable, depending on what you are observing within them. Your attention doesn't just highlight reality, it shapes which version of reality stabilizes for you, yet you were trained to dismiss this, to believe that your inner state is separate from what unfolds, that awareness is a flashlight, not a factor. That observation doesn't change the thing being observed. So when patterns repeat, you assume coincidence. When outcomes feel familiar, you assume inevitability. You rarely suspect that the way you are watching might be part of what keeps appearing. In quantum physics, the observer cannot be fully removed from the experiment. In daily life, you are told to remove yourself entirely. Be objective. Be detached. As if that were even possible. But your nervous system is always involved. Your expectations are always present. Your history is always whispering suggestions about what this moment is likely to become. When you walk into a situation expecting resistance, you observe selectively. Tone sharpens. Neutral signals feel ambiguous. Your behavior subtly adjusts, often without awareness. The interaction then unfolds in a way that seems to confirm what you expected. Not because the universe is conspiring, but because observation and response are entangled. Physics uses that word carefully. Entanglement means two things can no longer be fully described independently. Change one, and the other is affected, not by force, by relationship. Your inner state and your experience of the world are far more entangled than you were taught to believe. This is why ignoring the observer comes at a cost. You begin to believe that reality is doing something to you, instead of with you. You feel pushed, judged, trapped by circumstances that feel solid and unquestionable. Meanwhile, the role your attention plays stays invisible. And invisibility is powerful. What you don't see, you don't question. The moment you begin to notice that observation participates in experience, a quiet responsibility appears. Not guilt, not pressure, just awareness. You start to sense that where you place your attention is not trivial, that what you expect subtly prepares the field. This doesn't mean you control outcomes. It means you influence conditions. And that influence becomes clearer when you notice how strongly the mind wants to protect its existing view. Once an interpretation is formed, attention starts working to defend it. Evidence is selected. Contradictions are minimized. The observer becomes loyal to its own conclusions, which leads to a deeper, more uncomfortable realization. You are not just observing reality. You are constantly confirming what you already believe about it. And that confirmation process may be the strongest force shaping what you call reality without you ever noticing it. This is one of the hardest things to notice about yourself because it doesn't feel like a program. It feels like common sense. It feels like clarity. It feels like seeing things as they are. But underneath that confidence, something quieter is happening. Your mind is constantly searching for proof that its current view of the world is correct, not because it wants truth, because it wants stability. Once a belief forms, your brain begins to protect it. It filters information, emphasizes certain details, ignores others, and rearranges meaning so that the belief remains intact. This happens automatically. You don't sit down and decide to do it. It happens before you're aware of choosing anything at all. If you believe people can't be trusted, you'll notice every inconsistency and miss every quiet act of reliability. If you believe opportunities are scarce, you'll see competition everywhere and overlook openings that don't match your expectations. If you believe you're not that kind of person, your attention will quietly steer you away from evidence that suggests otherwise. This is not weakness, it's efficiency. The brain prefers being consistent over being accurate. Consistency feels safe. Accuracy requires constant updating, and updating requires energy, uncertainty, and humility. So the mind does what it does best. It confirms. And once confirmation begins, it becomes self-reinforcing. You start to feel justified. You say, "See, this always happens." You collect examples. You tell the story again, slightly stronger each time. Over time, the belief doesn't feel like a belief anymore. It feels like reality itself. That's the trap. Because the moment a belief hardens into the way things are, your perception narrows. You stop exploring, you stop testing, you stop noticing anything that doesn't fit neatly into the existing frame. The world becomes predictable but smaller, stable but constrained. Most people mistake this narrowing for maturity. They say they've learned how life works. What they've really learned is how to confirm what they already think, and the cost of that confirmation is possibility. Pay attention to how quickly your mind explains things. A failed attempt becomes proof. A difficult conversation becomes a verdict. A moment of fear becomes an identity. The explanation arrives fast, polished, and convincing. Rarely do you pause to ask, what else could this mean? Because the brain isn't rewarded for openness. It's rewarded for closure. Once closure is reached, attention relaxes. The system feels done. But life doesn't stop moving just because your interpretation did. This is why people often feel stuck, even when nothing obvious is blocking them. The limitation is not external, it's perceptual. The mind has decided what's likely, what's possible, and what's worth trying. Everything outside that boundary becomes invisible or irrelevant. You might call it realism. But realism, when unexamined, is often just familiarity wearing a serious face. There's a subtle emotional payoff to confirmation. It gives you a sense of control. If you already know how things end, you don't have to stay open. You don't have to risk being wrong. You don't have to tolerate ambiguity. The price you pay is aliveness. Notice how different it feels when something truly surprises you. There's energy there. Attention sharpens. Time feels different. For a moment, your internal model loosens its grip. Those moments are rare not because life lacks novelty, but because your mind filters most of it out. And here's the part that's easy to miss. Confirmation doesn't just shape what you see, it shapes how you feel in your body. Beliefs carry emotional tone. Expectation tightens or softens you before anything happens. If you expect struggle, your body braces. If you expect ease, it opens slightly. That physical shift then feeds back into perception, reinforcing the belief. The loop closes again. Over time, this loop becomes your default state. You don't just believe something intellectually, you embody it. And once a belief lives in the body, it becomes even harder to question. It feels true in your muscles, your breath, your posture. This is why arguments rarely change minds. You're not challenging an idea, you're challenging a whole system of confirmation that's been running quietly for years. To loosen that system, effort is not enough. Willpower usually just recruits the same beliefs in a different direction. What's required first is noticing, catching the moment where your mind rushes to explain, feeling the emotional tone underneath the explanation, sensing how familiar it is. That familiarity is the clue. When you start seeing how often your mind chooses the known over the possible, something shifts. Not dramatically, subtly. You begin to pause before agreeing with your own conclusions. You leave small questions open instead of sealing them shut. And as those questions remain open, you may begin to notice something deeper than belief itself, guiding your confirmations. Something more primal than thought, an underlying emotional state that decides which beliefs feel right, which interpretations feel convincing, and which versions of reality you keep attracting again and again. This idea can feel uncomfortable at first, because it seems to suggest that what you experience outside of you is somehow tied to what's happening inside of you. And most people resist that. They want reality to be solid, independent, unquestionable, something that simply happens, something they respond to. But if you observe carefully over time, a different pattern begins to reveal itself. Your inner state acts like a lens. Not a poetic lens, but a functional one. It quietly colors what stands out, what feels important, what feels threatening, and what feels possible. And because that coloring happens instantly, you don't experience it as interpretation. You experience it as the world itself. When you're internally settled, the world feels more spacious. Problems don't disappear, but they feel workable. People seem more reasonable. Time feels less aggressive. The same tasks exist, the same conversations happen, yet the texture of life changes. Now contrast that with moments when you're anxious, exhausted, or emotionally overloaded. Suddenly everything feels sharper. Noise feels intrusive. Neutral interactions feel tense. Small obstacles feel personal. It's tempting to say, well, of course the world feels worse when I feel worse, but notice how quickly the mind flips that relationship around. It says, I feel worse because the world is worse. Traffic is worse. People are worse. Life is heavier. And the inner state disappears from the explanation. Yet nothing external may have actually changed. What changed was the internal climate through which everything was interpreted. Your inner state is not just an emotion you notice from time to time. It's a background condition, a baseline, and that baseline quietly instructs your perception on how to assemble reality. When that baseline is tense, your mind looks for reasons. When it's calm, it looks for flow. When it's defensive, it looks for threat. When it's open, it notices nuance. You don't wake up each morning and consciously choose this baseline. It's shaped by sleep, stress, unresolved emotion, memory, anticipation, and once it's set, it runs silently, influencing thousands of micro-interpretations throughout the day. This is why two people can describe the same world so differently. One says, everything feels hostile lately. The other says, things are challenging but manageable. They're not lying. They're reporting from different inner states. The world they're meeting is being filtered through different emotional tones. And here's where it becomes subtle. Your inner state doesn't just color how you interpret events. It influences how you behave within them. Tone of voice shifts, body language changes, patience shortens or expands. Those changes affect how others respond to you, which then feeds back into your perception of reality. The loop closes again. From the inside, it feels like reality is confirming how you feel. From the outside, it's clear that how you feel is participating in what unfolds. This doesn't mean you create every event. It means you co-create the experience of those events. Meaning, intensity, impact, all of that is shaped internally before it feels external. Most people underestimate how much of their world is actually a mood stabilized over time. Stay in frustration long enough, and frustration starts to look like truth. Stay in fear long enough, and the world begins to look dangerous. Stay in resentment long enough, and neutrality feels like disrespect. None of this requires conscious intent. It's the natural outcome of an inner state becoming familiar, and familiarity is powerful. The brain trusts what's familiar. The body relaxes into it even if it's uncomfortable. So an inner state that once arose as a response can quietly become a permanent filter. From there, reality seems to match it everywhere you look. This is why changing circumstances without changing inner state often disappoints. The new environment gets interpreted through the old lens. New people get read through old expectations. New opportunities feel strangely limited. The outside shifts, but the experience doesn't. People call this bad luck or pattern repetition. But often, it's coherence, inner state staying consistent, and perception doing its job. What's rarely acknowledged is that inner state is not just emotional, it's physiological. Your breath, your muscle tension, your posture, your nervous system, all of it participates. And because it's embodied, it feels real, solid, justified. So when someone suggests that reality might be reflecting your inner state, it can sound like denial, as if your experience is being dismissed. But the opposite is true. It's being taken seriously enough to be examined at its source. Once you start noticing this relationship, you don't immediately change it. That's not the first step. The first step is recognizing patterns, seeing how certain moods reliably produce certain versions of reality, how certain inner tones attract certain kinds of interactions, how your day often unfolds in harmony with how you started it internally. That noticing alone begins to loosen the illusion that reality is fully separate from you. And as that illusion weakens, another layer comes into view. Because beneath inner state lies something even more influential than mood or thought. A deeper signal that your body is constantly emitting, shaping how you move, choose, and respond. Something closer to a frequency than an emotion, quietly guiding what you resonate with next. Most people believe their decisions are guided by logic. They tell themselves a story where they think, evaluate, weigh options, and then choose. But if you slow down and watch yourself honestly, you'll notice something else happens first. Before reasoning appears, before words form, there's already a tone inside you, a background feeling, a subtle emotional charge that sets the direction long before the mind explains it. That charge is what we're calling emotional frequency. It's not dramatic. It's not always intense. Most of the time, it's quiet enough to be ignored. But it's always there, humming underneath your thoughts, shaping what feels natural, safe, urgent, or impossible. And because it operates below conscious awareness, it feels like you, like intuition, like personality, like reality itself. Your emotional frequency is not just what you feel in a moment. It's the average emotional state your system returns to when nothing special is happening, the baseline you live from. Some people live mostly in tension, others in guardedness, others in curiosity, others in resignation. And that baseline quietly commands thousands of decisions every day. It decides what you notice when you enter a room. It decides whether you speak or stay silent, whether you lean forward or pull back, whether an idea feels exciting or exhausting, whether an opportunity feels risky or obvious, and none of this requires conscious thought. If your frequency is colored by fear, your decisions aim for protection. You choose what reduces discomfort fastest, not what expands you. If your frequency is shaped by frustration, your choices carry impatience. You react instead of respond. If your frequency is shaped by calm, decisions feel cleaner. You can tolerate uncertainty longer. You don't rush to close things prematurely. From the inside, it never feels like my emotional frequency is guiding me. It feels like logic. It feels like preference. It feels like common sense. That's what makes it so powerful. Your body is always signaling. Through muscle tension, through breathing patterns, through energy levels, those signals inform the brain about what kind of world it's in. Safe or unsafe, predictable or unstable, welcoming or hostile. The brain then selects decisions that match that signal. So if your body is signaling threat, the brain prioritizes defense. If your body is signaling scarcity, the brain prioritizes control. If your body is signaling openness, the brain allows exploration. You don't decide these priorities. They're inferred from your internal state. This is why two people with the same information make completely different choices. One sees a risk, the other sees an opening. One hesitates, the other moves. It's not intelligence, it's frequency alignment. Over time, emotional frequency becomes self-confirming. You make choices that match it. Those choices produce outcomes that reinforce it. And soon, it feels like that's just how life is. But it's actually coherence between your inner signal and your external behavior. Most people try to change their lives by changing decisions while ignoring the frequency those decisions are coming from. They push themselves to act confident while living in fear. They force motivation while living in exhaustion. They chase positivity while carrying unresolved tension. And when it doesn't last, they blame themselves. But willpower can't overpower frequency for long. Frequency always wins because it operates earlier in the process. It decides what options even feel available to you, what you consider realistic, what you dismiss instantly, what you don't even see. Notice how often you say, "That's not for me," without really exploring why. Or "I could never do that," without testing the assumption. That's frequency speaking, not truth. And emotional frequency is not fixed, but it is trained. It's trained by repetition, by unresolved experiences, by long-held interpretations, by patterns of stress and relief, by what you've learned to expect. The body remembers what the mind tries to forget, and it keeps broadcasting that memory as a signal. That signal becomes your default command. The key insight here is not to judge your frequency. Judging only adds noise. The first real shift begins when you start to notice it, to feel it in your body before you act, to sense the emotional tone underneath a decision before you justify it. When you do that, something subtle happens. You create a pause, and in that pause, frequency becomes observable instead of invisible. You might notice that a choice you're about to make is coming from contraction, or urgency, or avoidance. And simply seeing that doesn't immediately change the choice, but it weakens its grip. The decision is no longer obvious, it's contextual. As awareness grows, you begin to realize that many of your decisions are not chosen. They're triggered, automatic. executed by a system trying to stay consistent with its current state. And that realization naturally raises a deeper question. If emotional frequency is silently commanding your choices, how much control do you really have? How many of your decisions are truly deliberate, and how many are simply the body running a familiar program without asking for permission? Because once you see how automatic this process is, the idea of being in control starts to look very different. This isn't an accusation, it's an observation. And once you see it clearly, it can feel both unsettling and strangely relieving at the same time. Most of your day runs without you. You wake up and reach for your phone before deciding to. You react to a message before choosing how to feel. You follow routines, habits, tones of thought that activate automatically, as if a script were already in motion. And only afterward does the mind step in and say, "I decided this." That story of control comes after the action, not before it. Neuroscience has quietly shown this for years, but you don't need a lab to notice it. Just pay attention to how often a thought appears without being invited, how often an emotion rises before you understand why, how often your body leans forward or pulls back before you've made up your mind. You like to believe you're the author. In reality, you're often the editor, adjusting the narrative after the scene has already played out. This doesn't mean you have no agency. It means agency is layered, and most of its activity happens below conscious awareness. Your nervous system makes decisions faster than thought. It assesses safety, familiarity, risk, and reward in fractions of a second. By the time your rational mind starts explaining, the direction has often already been chosen. Logic doesn't lead as much as it justifies. That's why you can explain a decision beautifully, even when it clearly wasn't the best one. The explanation feels real because it's coherent. But coherence is not the same as control. Think about how often you repeat behaviors you've already decided don't serve you. You promise yourself you'll respond differently next time. You rehearse a calmer reaction. And then the moment arrives and the same response happens again. Not because you didn't know better, because the system that acted wasn't listening to knowledge. It was following conditioning. Control is comforting as an idea because it suggests predictability. If you're in charge, then outcomes make sense. Success is earned, failure is explained. But the truth is messier. Much of what you do is driven by momentum, by emotional states, by bodily signals that never ask for permission. The illusion of control survives because awareness is intermittent. You notice the moments where choice feels deliberate and overlook the hundreds of micro-decisions that happen automatically. You remember the times you paused and redirected yourself, and you forget how rare those pauses actually are. This illusion is reinforced by language. You say, "I chose," "I decided," "I wanted," when what you really mean is, "This is what happened through me." Language smooths over complexity. It makes the process feel cleaner than it is. But notice something important. The moments where you truly feel in control are usually moments of clarity, when your mind is quieter, when your body is regulated, when emotion isn't flooding the system. Control doesn't come from force, it comes from coherence. When you're overwhelmed, rushed, threatened, or emotionally charged, control decreases sharply. Decisions narrow, options disappear. You revert to habit. That's not a moral failure, it's a biological one. So the question stops being, "Why can't I control myself?" and becomes, "What state am I in when I try to choose?" Because the state determines the range of choices available to you. Most people try to change outcomes by applying more effort at the decision point. But effort applied too late only adds tension. The real drivers were already active long before the moment of choice arrived. This is why simply trying harder often backfires. It pits conscious intent against unconscious momentum, and momentum usually wins. The deeper deception is believing that awareness automatically equals control. It doesn't. You can be aware of a pattern and still be run by it. Insight alone doesn't rewire a system that has learned through repetition and emotion. But awareness does something else first. It creates space. When you see that you're not as in control as you thought, something softens. You stop blaming yourself so harshly. You stop moralizing your automatic responses. You begin to observe instead of immediately intervening. That observation is not passive, it's the beginning of leverage. Because while you may not control every thought or impulse, you do influence the conditions under which they arise. You influence your baseline state, your level of rest, your emotional processing, your patterns of attention. And those conditions shape how automatic your life feels. Control, in this deeper sense, is indirect. It's architectural, not tactical. Once you accept that much of your behavior is automatic, a new kind of curiosity appears. You start asking what those automatic patterns are protecting, what they're trying to maintain, what familiar state they're keeping you anchored to, and that curiosity points towards something crucial. If control is limited at the level of action, maybe it becomes possible at an earlier level, not at the level of forcing decisions, but at the level of perception itself. Because if the way you observe shapes your internal state, and your internal state shapes your decisions, then the real leverage may not be in controlling what you do, but in changing how you see. At first, that might sound ambitious, maybe even unrealistic, because observation feels automatic. You don't wake up and decide how to see the world. You just open your eyes, and there it is. Thoughts appear, reactions follow, life moves. It feels fixed, mechanical, outside your reach. But that feeling is part of the conditioning. The way you observe was learned, slowly, repeatedly, through experiences that taught your system what to expect, what to avoid, what to brace for, and what to ignore. And anything that was learned can be adjusted, not instantly, not forcefully, but gradually through a different kind of attention. Reprogramming observation does not mean controlling every thought or staying positive. It means changing where awareness rests before interpretation takes over. It means noticing how quickly meaning forms and learning to pause just long enough for another option to exist. Right now, most of your observation is reactive. Something happens, and your system immediately labels it. Good, bad, threatening, hopeless, promising. That label feels true because it's familiar, and once the label is applied, your emotional state follows it automatically. Reprogramming begins when you stop trying to change the label and start noticing the process that creates it. There is a small moment, often overlooked, between stimulus and story. A breath, a sensation, a tightening, a warmth, a shift in posture. That moment is where observation is still raw, not yet shaped by meaning. Most people rush past it because the mind wants certainty. But that moment is the entry point. When you start staying there, even briefly, something changes. You begin to observe your observing. You notice patterns instead of getting lost inside them. You see how certain situations reliably trigger certain interpretations, how familiar emotional tones rise before you even know what you're reacting to. This isn't abstract, it's physical. You can feel it in your chest, your jaw, your breathing. Observation is embodied long before it's intellectual. As you become aware of these signals, your system starts to update. Not because you force it, but because awareness itself is new information. The brain learns through feedback, and awareness is feedback. At first, the old patterns still run. You still react. You still feel pulled into the same interpretations. But something is different now. There's a faint sense of space, a recognition that this is happening in me, not this is how things are. That distinction is small, but it's everything. Because once observation loosens, emotional frequency begins to shift, not dramatically, subtly. You become less fused with reactions, less convinced by the first story that appears, less urgent about closing the loop. And that slight reduction in urgency changes how the body feels. Breath deepens, muscles release a bit. The nervous system exits emergency mode more often, and as that happens, perception widens. You notice more. Options appear where none existed before. This is how reprogramming actually works. Not by replacing thoughts, but by changing the state from which thoughts arise. Over time, new observations become possible. You start seeing neutral moments as neutral instead of threatening. Silence stops feeling loaded. Uncertainty becomes tolerable. And because your observation is calmer, your emotional frequency stabilizes. Decisions become less reactive. Behavior becomes less automatic. From the inside, it feels like life is responding differently to you. But what's really changed is the signal you're bringing into each moment. This doesn't mean life becomes easy. Challenges remain. Loss still hurts. Complexity doesn't disappear. What changes is how much unnecessary suffering is added by interpretation. You stop fighting what hasn't actually happened yet. You stop reacting to stories that aren't confirmed. You meet situations with more curiosity than defense. And that curiosity keeps your system flexible. Flexibility is the opposite of programming. The most important part is this: reprogramming observation is not about effort. Effort tightens the system. It reinforces control. What actually works is clarity, seeing patterns without judgment, noticing without trying to fix. When clarity grows, the system reorganizes itself. And this is where many people make a subtle mistake. They feel this shift beginning and immediately try to apply it to the outside world. They change environments, change people, change goals, expecting the new clarity to fix everything externally. But if the lens hasn't fully changed, the pattern returns, because the power has never been in what you look at. It's always been in how you look. This mistake is understandable. In fact, it feels logical. When something isn't working, you look for what's visible. The job, the relationship, the city, the routine, the schedule. You assume the problem lives out there, so the solution must live out there too. Change the scene, and the experience will change with it. Sometimes it does, briefly. There's often a rush at first. New surroundings, new people, new rules. Your system feels stimulated, even hopeful. For a moment it seems like you've escaped the pattern, but slowly, quietly, something familiar returns. The same emotional reactions, the same frustrations, just dressed differently. The same sense of effort, the same inner commentary now applied to a new context. That's when confusion sets in. You ask yourself why the change didn't hold. You did everything right. You made the move. You took the risk. You tried something different. And yet here you are again, feeling versions of what you thought you left behind. What followed you was not circumstance. It was the lens. The lens is the way you interpret, anticipate, and emotionally meet life. It's shaped by past experience, nervous system patterns, and repeated beliefs. And unless that lens changes, the external world gets reorganized to match it. This is why people can change partners and relive the same emotional dynamic, change careers and encounter the same stress, change locations and feel the same dissatisfaction. The details shift, but the internal pattern stays intact, quietly arranging perception to feel familiar again. The lens doesn't care about your intentions. It cares about coherence. Your system wants the world to make sense according to what it already knows. So when the outside changes, the lens looks for ways to interpret it through old rules. It highlights what fits, it downplays what doesn't, and before long the new environment feels strangely similar to the old one. From the inside, this feels like bad luck or repetition. From a deeper view, it's consistency. This doesn't mean external change is useless. It means it's incomplete when done alone. External shifts can create opportunities, but they can't override perception. They can expose patterns, but they don't dissolve them by themselves. The problem arises when external change is used as a substitute for inner clarity, when movement is used to avoid seeing, when novelty is used to outrun familiarity. You can stay very busy this way, always adjusting, optimizing, searching, always believing the next shift will finally fix what feels off. And because each change brings temporary relief, the strategy feels justified, until the cycle repeats again. What's rarely questioned is the observer making these moves. How are you interpreting challenge? How are you reading neutrality? How quickly do you assume meaning? How much tension are you carrying into new situations before anything actually happens? Those questions don't feel as actionable as changing a job or ending a relationship, but they're far more influential. The lens is subtle. It's not a thought you can argue with. It's a posture, a tone, an expectation that settles in the body. And because it's embodied, it feels like truth. So when people say, "I just need a fresh start," What they often mean is, I want the world to feel different without me having to see differently, and that's where the strategy breaks down. A fresh start without a fresh lens just produces a new version of the same experience. This is also why effort alone doesn't work. You can try harder, be more disciplined, be more positive, but if the lens is still scanning for threat, effort becomes strain. If the lens is still oriented toward lack, effort becomes exhaustion. You end up pushing against your own perception. Real shifts don't come from forcing better outcomes, they come from seeing more clearly. Clarity is not dramatic. It doesn't announce itself. It shows up as a quiet noticing, a realization that you've been reacting to assumptions, that you've been preparing for outcomes that weren't guaranteed, that you've been tightening before anything actually demanded it. When that clarity appears, even briefly, the lens softens. You stop projecting as aggressively. You allow moments to be incomplete. You wait a little longer before deciding what something means. And in that waiting, your internal state changes. That's the part most people miss. They think change begins with action, with movement, with decision. But the most powerful changes begin before action, at the level of perception. When the lens shifts, behavior follows naturally. Choices feel different. Effort feels lighter. Timing improves without being forced. Trying to change the external before changing the lens is like rearranging furniture while wearing distorted glasses. No matter how much you move things, the room still feels off. Take off the glasses, and suddenly the same room makes sense. And once you start to sense that, another realization begins to form. If the lens is this important, if it shapes effort, action, and outcome, then maybe real change doesn't begin with pushing at all. Maybe it begins with something quieter than effort, something more precise, something like clarity itself. This can feel counterintuitive, especially if you've been taught that progress comes from pushing harder, trying longer, and refusing to quit. Effort is praised. Discipline is admired. Struggle is often mistaken for seriousness, so when something isn't working, your instinct is to apply more force, more willpower, more pressure, more self-control. But if effort alone created real change, most people would already be living very different lives. Effort is not where things break down. Most people are already trying, they're already pushing, already managing, fixing, improving. What's missing is not intensity, it's precision. Clarity is what gives effort direction. Without clarity, effort is blind. It exhausts the system without actually changing its structure. You can run faster and still be on the wrong road. You can push harder and still reinforce the same patterns. And when effort fails, the mind usually turns inward with judgment instead of stepping back to see more clearly. Clarity works differently. It doesn't strain the system. It organizes it. When you see something clearly, action follows with less resistance. Not because you force yourself, but because the confusion that created friction is no longer there. The body relaxes. The mind simplifies. Choices become obvious instead of debated. Think about moments in your life when something truly shifted. Not gradually, but decisively. Often it wasn't because you tried harder. It was because you finally saw something you hadn't been seeing before. A pattern, a truth, a mismatch you had been rationalizing. Once you saw it, the change almost happened on its own. That's clarity. Clarity removes internal conflict, and internal conflict is what drains energy. Most effort is spent fighting yourself. One part wants change, another part wants safety. One part pushes forward, another part applies the brakes. The result is fatigue, not transformation. You feel busy but stuck. Clarity dissolves that conflict by making things visible. When you clearly see how a behavior costs you, you don't need discipline to stop it. When you clearly see what sustains you, you don't need motivation to move toward it. The system aligns naturally. This is why clarity often feels quiet. It doesn't shout. It doesn't demand. It settles. And clarity doesn't come from thinking harder. It comes from seeing honestly, seeing how often you react instead of choose, seeing how often fear disguises itself as practicality, seeing how often you confuse familiarity with truth, seeing how much of your effort is spent compensating for a lens that hasn't been questioned. Once those things are seen, effort changes its role. It becomes supportive instead of corrective. It's used to maintain alignment, not to force outcomes. There's also a physical aspect to this. When clarity appears, the body responds. Breathing shifts, tension releases, decisions feel less urgent. The nervous system moves out of survival mode and into regulation. From that state, your perception widens. You can tolerate uncertainty. You can wait. You can choose more carefully. Effort applied from a regulated state feels completely different from effort applied from tension. One is sustainable, the other is not. Most people try to use effort to escape discomfort. Clarity invites you to understand it instead. And understanding is far more effective than resistance. This doesn't mean clarity is comfortable. Sometimes it reveals things you've been avoiding. Sometimes it shows you that what you've been pushing for isn't actually aligned. Sometimes it asks you to stop instead of strive. That can feel threatening to an identity built around effort. But clarity doesn't take anything away that was truly working. It only removes what was maintained by confusion. Once clarity is present, change doesn't feel heroic. It feels obvious. You stop forcing conversations that drain you. You stop chasing goals that don't resonate. You stop explaining away patterns that no longer make sense, not because you're disciplined, but because continuing would feel dishonest. This is why clarity is the real beginning. Before habits change, before behaviors shift, before results appear. And clarity is not a one-time event. It deepens as observation refines. As the lens becomes cleaner, effort becomes lighter. Action becomes more precise. And the system starts to move with less friction. From here, the question naturally shifts again. If clarity is what initiates real change, what exactly creates clarity in the first place? What allows perception to sharpen without force, without struggle, without turning effort into another form of control? Because clarity doesn't come from pushing. It comes from a particular quality of seeing. And that quality changes everything that follows. You've moved. You've tried. You've adjusted the outside more than once. And yet the pattern followed, not because you failed, but because the lens stayed the same. Reality has never been just events unfolding around you. It has always been experience shaped through you. The moment that becomes clear, something subtle but irreversible begins. You stop fighting life as if it was separate. You start meeting it with awareness instead of reflex. And if all of this sounds absurd, unsettling, or strangely familiar, maybe that's not resistance, maybe it's recognition. Awakening rarely feels comfortable at first. It feels disorienting, like realizing you've been looking through tinted glass your whole life. Once you notice the glass, you can't pretend it isn't there, and slowly, patiently, it begins to clear. If you made it all the way here, write this phrase in the comments. I'm learning to see clearly. It lets me know you stayed until the end. And if this resonated, choose one of the videos appearing on your screen now. If you want more clarity like this, that's where it continues.